Are you tired of sifting through endless health advice that promises quick fixes but delivers nothing but frustration? Welcome to the Anti-Macro Podcast, the go-to place for scientifically backed yet digestible health and fitness wisdom without the fads or gimmicks. Whether you're looking to ditch chronic dieting, optimize your hormone and gut health, or simply find balance in your wellness journey, you're in the right place. I'm Coach Diana Lee, your no-nonsense guide to transforming your health and mindset for the better. Each episode, I'll dive into topics ranging from nutrition basics to debunking common myths to cutting-edge functional health insights, sometimes featuring guest experts in the space. Get ready to learn, grow, and take actionable steps toward a healthier and happier you. So grab your favorite beverage, kick back, and let's dive in. Thank you so much, Blake, for joining me on the podcast. You have such a diverse background in wellness, so I'd love for you to share your journey and what has shaped your career and your methodologies as well.
Yeah, so I have been very fortunate to be given a lot of different opportunities. So my background is in chiropractic, graduated from chiropractic school in 2015 and immediately began into the world of sports medicine. So I started doing my postgraduate courses and getting my certifications. And as I worked with a lot of different athletes, I ended up working with a lot of women's sports. The very first team I worked with was a women's soccer team in Dallas, and quickly realized I didn't know enough. That was a big thing for me, especially I think as a male coming into a female space, is having to understand the nuances, what is different and what's not different, right? I think sometimes we can get too focused on the differences while missing some basics, but that really helped shape a lot of my mindset going forward to then working with a lot of dance troupes and drill teams. I then started into my journey into performance science, understanding a lot more of strength and conditioning. And I moved into the space of education after COVID hit and I went out of private practice for a little bit. I ended up becoming a clinical instructor at a university teaching sports medicine, and then was very fortunate to end up working at Canyon Ranch in Tucson, Arizona, where I worked as one part of a holistic health and performance team. And there was where I had the incredible opportunity to learn from, I think, some of the best in the field of wellness, or get access to people within the wellness sphere. We had a lot of experts from around the world come into our facility to not just teach guests, but teach us as well, and vice versa. So I got to round out my knowledge with having access to nutritionist, performance scientist, mental health, spiritual health, but medical as well, understanding all the different tests that are out there. So I've been very fortunate to be thrown into a lot of various aspects. And that's probably the biggest thing I try to teach young practitioners is say yes. I think a lot of young practitioners, whatever field they're in, they get so focused on, I need to be so niche in whatever I'm doing, that they forget that there's a whole other world out there. I was guilty of that early on. All right. I'm sports. Well, who plays sports? Everybody. Whether or not we consider it a sport, if I'm going for a walk, is that athletic? Absolutely. So how can you take some of that knowledge and apply it to anybody who might be in front of you and understand how to change your worldview to fit that person in front of you? Is instead of getting them to fit your worldview, change your approach to fit that person, because meeting that patient where they are is always going to be the most important thing. So learning from others is a big deal for me, as I try not to be the smartest person in the room. Is I always want to be learning. And if we can have that mindset, that I think sets us up for all the future opportunities where we can learn, but then we become the educators on teaching people how to be holistic.
Yeah, I love that approach of meeting people where they're at and also learning how to work with the individual rather than, when we begin learning all of this stuff, we want clear protocols, we want step-by-step instructions, and then we want our clients or our patients to follow those instructions to a T. And I think once we get into the weeds with it, we learn really early on that that's not how the human body works a lot. And you actually mentioned, so you described that you worked for like holistic sports medicine. And I think holistic gets thrown around a lot. I know sometimes I use it myself, but I get really nervous that people might see it as like the woo woo side of things. So,
Mhm.
in your experience, what did holistic sports medicine look like?
Holistic sports medicine is understanding the person as a whole, which that's where I like to spell it WHO, right? Is holistic. Because yes, I that was my initial thought process too. Even when I started at Canyon Ranch and I saw their spiritual wellness, my immediate thought was, oh no. And then as I got to know the providers there, it was a major learning experience for me, seeing how important that actually is and understanding that some people's religion beliefs, that is going to be a major part of why they choose to do the things they do, even from a musculoskeletal perspective. Is there's a lot of cultural and beliefs that will change their activity levels, what they can or can't do. So if you can understand the person as a whole, that can play a role in sports medicine. So not only am I responsible for knowing the biomechanics and musculoskeletal aspects of what the person is trying to do, but what does their diet look like? And not from a, okay, adhere to this and you can have carbs at this time, but not at this time, intermittent fasting. It's more of just, what do you have access to? What is available for you to eat at your disposal, whether you're at work, you're at home, and understanding how family life plays a role into what's going to fit your schedule. That is holistic care, not necessarily being zen or being overly woo woo. While I think that there's elements for that, and some people really they can respond well to that stuff. So there's even an element that you kind of have to get into that as well, but it's not always going to be just the crunchy granola aspects. But when they do come in, we know how to communicate and get on the same level. It's about communication. I think that's really what holistic comes down to, is how do we communicate in a way that we can all be on the same page, but not just look from our very simplistic glasses from our own scope. Is take big picture, know what your role is, but understand the person and the condition as a whole.
Absolutely. I am 100% on board. There is a time and place for the woo woo stuff, but it's really nice when we can rope science into it and then also the human aspect. What does the physical person actually need? What do they have access to? I love that, truly holistic approach of taking into account all these different angles of health and wellness. And so when you're looking at your approach specifically and a lot of it, how it's built over time, what do you feel is different in your approach from the traditional mainstream health and fitness approaches?
I definitely came into practice at the same time that social media really took off. So that has, I think, been a major part of seeing what is popular versus what is evidence based. And it's real easy to stick in one of those camps and not be able to be flexible going either way. So what I mean by that, obviously there's a lot of bad information online, right? When influencers get online, they say, I adhere to this, you should buy this product. I don't know an exact percentage, but we know they're all paid to say those things, right? Is it really what's going on? We don't know. So it's hard to look at those things and see their success and say, well, why can't I have that? And so you kind of buy into those elements of, yeah, you should do this, this fad diet or buy this product. On the other side of it, though, I also see a lot of people who consider themselves evidence based that are so inundated with random controlled trials and, well, the evidence is unclear, therefore no, none of this is good. So from my perspective, I probably was more in that second group of being overly evidence based, to saying, well, the research is unclear, so therefore no, we can't say anything about that. And that doesn't help the person in front of you. If we talk about things like posture, for example, the overreaching evidence says that posture does not play a role in pain. And so the problem with that, though, is when we just look at all the research, there's no clear evidence. That doesn't mean that posture can't play a role, but if we take that systematic approach, yeah, it's not the direct consensus, but there's other things that are in there. So it's about reading those individual studies that can help fit that person again in front of you. Is a person is not a research study. That was probably the biggest learning curve for me. Was, someone comes in, they say I've got this going on. I say, well, the evidence says this, so I can't I can't help you. Versus being overly n equals one. While that's good, if we can't apply the same things over and over and see those patterns, that can be troublesome as well. So it's a balancing act. I think that has been the biggest learning curve is understanding when you can use evidence, but also knowing what's good for that person in front of you. So I've tried to move away from saying I'm evidence based to more evidence informed. Is use the best evidence you have, but at the same token, what have you seen as a practitioner and what is important to that patient or that client? If you can get on their level and understand if there is good research out there and understanding what is going on, great, let's utilize it. But from a lot of our injury research or fitness research, there's a lot of things that just aren't clear. So we have to know when to shift and understand the whole person to know, okay, I see the nuances. Now I can know how to apply what I've learned and what I've seen.
Yeah. And I think the term evidence-based now is almost having its own resurgence on the social media platforms. And a lot of people are claiming that they're evidence-based. And then we throw around studies really, really willy-nilly on the social media space. So I love the idea of being more evidence-informed, because also, as you mentioned, like, people are not studies. And in a lot of ways, what works for one person won't always work for the other. And you have to play around with what is going to be better for the individual at hand. And studies are often, controlled, and real life is not controlled. And so it's so much harder to treat people using explicitly only evidence-based, strategies, but having evidence informed and knowing that you have a little bit more flexibility with your approach is huge.
Yeah, that's, I think, troublesome for a lot of people who want to be objective. Is we can get almost like an analysis paralysis of I got to be objective, I got to be objective. And when we can use it, that's great. But at the same token, subjective is important as well. How do people feel? What is changing day to day? And like you said, people's lives are so variable that it's hard to pinpoint one or two things and say, oh, well, we know exactly what's going on. You know, how did you sleep? How did you eat? How stressful was your day? All those things all play a role into then how we create output. And that's going to change then how somebody's going to exercise that day. That's going to change, how an exercise even feels. Is you could be doing the exact same weight, the exact same sets, and it just is different. And unfortunately, then a lot of maybe trainers or medical professionals then kind of go, oh, I don't know what's going on. That's weird. And then we think there's a big setback, and it's about long-term trajectory. It's not about taking snapshots. While that's all we get, right? Is we only live in the present, but we want to see where are we going, where are we heading, and that's where some of that objective data can be helpful to see are we on the right track. I was having a conversation with someone today about smartwatches and some of the data that's on there, and it's good stuff, right? But we can overuse it and pay way too much attention, even though it is objective data, it's not telling the whole story. So we have to look over time. We have to look at what metrics are important. And then sometimes it's just a wait and see. It's, we don't have to freak out when our HRV all of a sudden it goes haywire, or, our watch says we slept horrible. It's about, okay, well, let's see tomorrow. Let's see the next day, and then go from there. Use the objective with the subjective to make sure that we're doing what's best for our patients and clients.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you on the smartwatches and when I love the data. I have an Aura ring myself. My clients use a lot of these, Aura rings, Whoop, Apple Watch, you name it, right? And we can look at the data, but we also have to look at those outside variables and what's going on there. And I recently had a client, we've historically looked at her HRV and whatnot. And she's like, hey, my recovery is really low. My body's really struggling. And I'm like, okay, well, are you feeling XYZ symptoms? And she's like, no. I'm like, okay, I don't think we really need to be worried. And she's like, yeah, but it's really low. Okay, well, there's a lot of things going on. I pointed out a few variables. Let's wait and see. Let's watch the data. Let's see how your body recovers over the next few days. But you don't have any alarm bells going off. If we're looking at the other symptoms, the other biofeedback, sometimes our Oura ring is going to say that we're not feeling good today, but you might feel just fine. We still always have to be intuitive and cross check the data with also the biofeedback and what's going on as the whole picture.
Yeah, there's some interesting research on just doing some objective scaling of subjective feelings. So when it comes to like athlete wellness, the probably the best data we have is just even ranking our stress, our soreness, our sleep. All of that is actually very well validated. And you do have to do a little bit of teaching on, okay, what do these scales mean? And so we give that those in ranges, and it's always going to be on the spectrum. But from what I've been able to read, is one of our best data points, which is one thing that I do love about like on my Garmin is after I complete an exercise, rank how you feel. Because yeah, sometimes from an objective standpoint, my heart rate was fantastic. I hit all my goals and I felt like trash. Or other days I'm feeling amazing and I look down, it's like, whoa, that was not good. And then some days it fits perfectly. So it's bigger than just what can be pinpointed on these devices. I also think there can be a big nocebo effect. Is yeah, you wake up and it says you slept horribly, so now you create that mental picture of, well, it said I slept horrible, so I slept horrible. I have to get onto a lot of people about that. Of okay, no, tell me how you actually felt. Okay, let's actually look at that data. Hey, it slipped. No wonder it said you slept horrible. I've got tattoos on my wrist, and sometimes my watch falls back here, so it misses part of the night on measuring my heart rate. So my HRV, I can wake up and it's horrible, but I know I slept through the night perfectly. So even little things like that on it just didn't fit right is don't put so much emphasis on what it tells you that it's creating that mindset for you. Do those self checks because that is just as valid as some of these measurements. But if we see that pattern over and over and over, okay, now we got to see what could be going on. Do we have an underlying issue? What's really cool too is even almost predicting some illness, right? On, ooh, you've got 3 days of horrible HRV, and then sure enough, okay, now we got a fever. All right, let's dial it back. Let's let your body rest and recover, and then let's get right back into it.
Right. Yeah. All about that trend analysis and really looking at it, again, from a biofeedback perspective and also from a very sound of mind perspective. Let's not get caught up in the data.
Mm-hmm.
Tracking back, right? So you went into working with women and women's fitness without really feeling like you knew a lot about women's fitness and there was that learning curve. What do you feel like you learned was the same for women as it is to men? And where did things start to change? And what kind of other strategies did you apply solely to women to help your women clients?
So I think the first thing that is the same is overall training methodologies. The the problem I saw, especially from like a let's say a middle school and high school perspective, is a lot of females are not given access to strength and conditioning the same way that men are. I had to write a letter to a school, and I invoked Title IX, which is when things changed when I threw that word out there because this school was not allowing girls into the weight room. So I wrote this whole letter about, do you actually know that women mature faster skeletally than boys? So actually, your policy should be the complete reverse. The boys shouldn't be allowed in there. The girls should be. So there's even still some old school mindset of, well, girls can't do it, so therefore they shouldn't. And that's even part of the theory as to why we see more ACL injuries in women's sports than we do in men's sports is because of the access to strength and conditioning. So we like to think that there's a lot of differences, but for the most part, bones and muscles are bones and muscles. There's a couple of hormonal differences in understanding when things do cycle and what access we have to certain hormones like testosterone, free estrogen. But overall, you're going to respond the same way to stimulus. So we don't have to necessarily change our training patterns based on gender. And that's even kind of a weird thing happening right now. I don't know if everyone has seen, they're trying to fund a study looking at women's cycle and ACL injuries in soccer. And It's funny. I see both sides of the arguments of going, well, women have always had cycles. So why then all of a sudden are we saying that it's involved into ACL tears? But then there was a research article I read today where it did show that there was some aerobic differences based on luteal phase. So the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. So it's observing those differences. So especially when it comes to hormones, yes, there are going to be differences in how men and women react to hormones, but athletes generally are athletes. And so we want to make sure that we're not inherently changing our mindset to how we create strength, hypertrophy, and endurance because of any perceived difference. On the flip side, we do know that our bodies react to hormones. So for a lot of the sports where we have to deal with body composition, that is going to play a big role. And even doing some snapshots with blood work and looking at some of those biomarkers, especially hormones, can be helpful for identifying why we may or may not be hitting certain goals. So if we're in a sport or activity that does require certain body compositions, that can be telling and also give us insight to overall health. There's been such a great push into understanding low energy availability and relative energy deficiency syndromes, which is great when we can do some preemptive blood work on seeing how are we trending. Maybe we can find something before it becomes a problem, and understanding how well that our female athletes are creating the different phases in their menstrual cycle. Especially as a male healthcare worker, I need to ask those questions. How is your period? Is it consistent? Is it regular? Because that's where we can really key in on certain health indicators. I've got multiple examples, but a couple that come to mind. I had some young females who came into my office with hip pain. And as I'm doing my examination, some things aren't adding up. So I start asking these questions about their periods. So for two of these young girls, as I asked that, both of them were late. We of course went into asking things about sexual activity just to make sure we're not again missing certain things. But both of them discussed how they had been irregular and then they had missed periods. So as we did some testing, sure enough, both of them were positive for polycystic ovarian syndrome. And so that manifestation of musculoskeletal pain was actually because of hormonal changes that were happening. It is, that's not a question I'm going to ask any of my biologically male athletes because they are not going to have the same hormonal fluctuations that a female does. So it's important to note those differences, but we don't want to overanalyze and overreact to, well, what phase of your cycle are you in? I haven't seen any data to say, well, we need to completely change our training based on that. Part of it is there's just not enough research. There was a really good article that came out last year that showed how underfunded women's sports are from a research perspective. Because I want to say somewhere around 90% of all the sports research was on all males. And so any of the data that we're getting, it's kind of hard to say one way or another. So it's right now, I think we're still in an information gathering phase. So we don't want to make any conclusions just yet on what are fully the same and what are fully different, but acknowledging and listening to those athletes on, well, what are you feeling? That's going to be helpful for gauging what we need to do.
Right. And it's so frustrating to say that in 2025, we are in the information gathering stage on women in sports, but we know that that is the state of the world. That is what we're working with. And we talk about, training and alternating our trainings through our cycles. So we have something called cycle syncing, which I'm lukewarm on. I think cycle syncing can be appropriate depending on the person, but I am not pro like every woman should be cycle syncing. But I would think that it would probably be harder for, let's say, women in sports to adopt something like cycle syncing because they usually have competitions at specific times that are not planned according to their cycles, and they need to perform at their best all the time. So how exactly are you supporting a lot of your female athletes through training, almost all season while still also respecting their hormonal cycles and whatnot?
Yeah, that's where, I think obviously some tracking of that and that subjective rating along with just monitoring menstrual cycles is going to be helpful, because I do think, some of my female athletes can feel a lot more of those subjective symptoms more than others. So being respectful of that, of I am just low energy during this phase. Okay, maybe we need to back off just a little bit on how intense we're training, but other women aren't going to experience that. So we don't necessarily, again, need to overanalyze and say, well, you're in your preluteal phase, so this is going to be perfect time to hit your high intensity or whatnot. It's so nuanced, right? It's really difficult to say that, but it's important to listen. It's also important, if something changes, well, what's going on, right? That's where the individual tracking is going to be so helpful, of getting that athlete feedback. And that's where even just the periodic check-ins with a lot of my athletes, I try to do 2 check-ins a week of how are you feeling. And so we can see that trend, right? And when we see that there is a little bit of a down, okay, let's figure out what's going on. Okay, you're in this phase of your menstrual cycle. This is normal for you. Okay, we know we might need to just either back off or intensify based on what you're feeling. Um, it's the same but different. It's even the same as if you had a bad night of sleep and you're coming in feeling exhausted, and sure enough, some of your objective data is showing that you're neurologically slower today. Let's back off. And same for hormonal cycles. If the fluctuation in hormones is affecting your output, let's respect that. But also don't just go off entirely completely subjective. I think one area too that we can see bigger issues with that, again, is in sports or competitions with a lot of awareness of body composition. So especially with things like dance, cheerleading, gymnastics, especially, that's where that can be more problematic. Of well, because I'm in this phase of my cycle, now you're retaining water. Well, okay, I've put on 5 pounds in of primarily water weight, and now they're completely changing their diet around that. That's where we got to pump the brakes just a little bit on, okay, yes, you are performing, but let's not ruin your performance because of some either perceived differences in your body composition or physical differences. Yes, you are weighing a little bit more, probably not going to affect your performance from a physical perspective, but it might mentally. And just creating a safe space to have those discussions is always going to be important with those athletes. But tracking this again over time, from my experience, I haven't seen just wide range of variations within that. And so even in the off season, talking about these things, education around it is going to be helpful, so we can see in the low times versus the high times, what are those differences. Making sure we're peaking before competition, so we can see how do you perform and how do we need to change around either these perceived or physical differences based on your cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up like the dance and gymnastics worlds, and I'm a former gymnast, so I get it because lived it, breathed it, all of it, and it can be such a sensitive subject, especially when weight is involved. And a lot of the, girls and women that I was surrounded by in gymnastics, we were also very fixated on body size, not just because of the sport, but also because of the culture that we live in. And it can be so challenging now. And, knowing what I know now, I wish every woman would adopt that, fuel your body mindset for your performance. But we know that it's a little bit more of an uphill battle with the messaging of, okay, we got to do probably a little bit more education. We have to give some grace to the younger women, especially who are going through this, that we understand the messaging that you're getting. We understand, the social pressures to look a certain way, especially. We also know that the sport oftentimes has very negative talk around body sizes and whatnot. And it can be hard to prioritize, or it can be hard to get a woman to prioritize performance over body size when sometimes they're in that mindset and that headset.
Yeah, as a male, hard to, I've never had to experience that myself, right? But having a lot of female athletes in my office, it can make you angry listening to that and hearing it, of going, why does that matter? Like, it's not a big deal. How did you perform? Let's focus on that, because again, are we going to say the same thing with male athletes? We don't talk about it the same way. So it's still a culture issue that it'd be nice if we could just, wave a magic wand and fix the culture. But I do see some positive changes happening, especially I think with the growth of some of these professional women's sports, and especially on like the even the collegiate level. We're seeing such a positive media shift towards these female athletes and how we're talking about them that again, we're trending in the right direction. We're not there yet. There's still a lot of societal pressures on how they look, and it'll be nice if one day it's fair. Unfortunately, we're just not there.
Yeah, maybe we'll get there one day. Well, so when it comes to helping women with performance, right? So I think a lot of the messaging around health and fitness, and this could be my algorithm and it could be in the space that I'm in, but it's very driven towards lift heavy, lift a lot of weights. But I also see that things like high rocks are getting really, really popular. And so women are becoming very interested in training in more athletic styles, right? Not just sit in a gym and weight lift with sets and reps, but how can we get our bodies to do, amazing things like do a high rocks competition, do, ultra marathon or something like that. How might a woman approach doing something that's a little bit more athletic and a nice mixture of strength and conditioning training in an effective way?
With a lot of those kind of interval based exercise, especially high rocks, for a lot, not just females, I think a lot of people who get into that world is understanding what are your intentions and your goals with it. In my experience, for a lot of women who get into that stuff, part of it is a little bit of body composition, right? Well, I've got friends who are really fit who do this, so I want to get into this space. That's good. Like, we want to stay active, we want to do something, but are we trying to be competitive? Are we trying to be nationally ranked? That's where I try to key in with a lot of these athletes. If you're doing it to stay active, great, but you don't have to burn yourself out every single time. That has been an uphill battle with a lot of female athletes. And part of that is just, again, I think it's a little bit of social media space of, these fit influencers who are doing a lot of these great things, but they're trained for that, right? Is a lot of these people didn't start yesterday doing it. They've been doing it for years. Now, just because high rocks or anything like that took off and now it's popular, and you look at these high level athletes, they didn't just start, or they've been doing other similar type exercises. So setting expectations is probably the biggest thing I try to do with these athletes. Even for myself and my wife, we started doing triathlons last year, and that was, I know for myself, because I'm competitive, is just setting the mindset I am not going to be good for the first year. That's going to take a long time to create adaptation. So same for a lot of these women who want to get into these activities. Great. I want you to do whatever makes you happy. That's probably going to be a good thing for you to do. Let's just not make it all or nothing. It's going to be a while before you create those metabolic adaptations to be really, really efficient at doing this if you haven't already been doing it. And if you're moving from interval style exercise to another interval style exercise, you're probably going to do very well. But if you've been doing endurance type exercises, you've been a runner, and now you're trying to get into high rocks, give yourself some grace, give yourself some time, but you probably need to change a few things about your, not lifestyle, but some things within your lifestyle, your recovery methods, your diet. Sorry, I don't like that word diet. Nutrition. Let's say that. Hydration. All of that is gonna be different because you're changing the metabolic activity that's happening within your body. So giving enough time and not necessarily being all or nothing with that specific activity. Is we don't necessarily want to just jump ship on going straight from all cardio to all interval training or vice versa. It's about making sure we are being relatively rounded in a sense of giving our body variations of movement. I saw this back when CrossFit had its heyday 10 years ago, is people being so overly focused on, I got to get my WOD in on this day. And again, I got to be gassed by the end of it. And while CrossFit as a whole was really, really good, and they tried to put things in place to help prevent a lot of these metabolic burnouts, at the individual level, that could be tough. That's true with any group class, right? Is how do you create a group class that fits everybody's needs? The truth is you can't. It's not possible. You have to know the nuances of your people, and then those people need to know their own nuances and when to increase intensity, back it off a little bit. So that's where the education perspective is always going to be important of if we go 100% into something that is completely different than what we've been doing, there's a good chance we can create injury. That is, again, that's why we want to create yellow caution lights of nothing's off limits, but let's try and see how you feel, and let's make sure that you are recovering from this, especially if it's something very different. So on the other side of that coin, though, is looking at endurance. All right, now I want to do ultra marathons. All right, well, what's your current running pattern? Are you doing anything similar to it, or are we going straight from I did a lot of sprints in my group fitness class in my boot camp to I want to run 100 kilometers? All right, let's run a 10K first, then let's go to longer runs, and let's see how well your body's recovering from those training methodologies. So I never put anything off limits with anybody. I think that can be dangerous. It can creates great social media posts of always do this or never do this. But as I posted earlier on my social media, my old interns know my answer to almost everything is it depends. So nothing's off limits, but let's also see. Again, I want people to be active. If it's something that interests you, great. Let's try it. Let's see how you do. But really from a health perspective, that's always going to be where I'm going to take my viewpoint from being a healthcare provider is, are we staying healthy? As long as you stay healthy, I don't really care what it is. So let's just make sure that we are setting the parameters in place of knowing what is healthy, what's overtraining, what's overreaching, and then know when we need to push it or we need to back off.
Yeah, because a lot of times the people who are taking on these more competitive forms of fitness, especially in their adult years, they're former competitors. And so they're looking for that high that we used to get from athletic, endeavors that we used to do, from competition. Even being in a group fitness class and being really competitive with each other can really light people up. And, I was in the CrossFit space for a long time, for about a decade. And I agree with you. There were some great aspects about CrossFit, but getting people to not go 100% every single day and understand that that is a fast road to injury. I mean, even myself, like I was at a point where I was training a lot and I was overtraining. I did a number on my body. So I learned through, I learned through experience, but it's hard getting people to either back off, taper their training, or find an intensity that makes sense for them and their ability to recover, because that's really huge. It's like, how many times do we walk into, a group fitness class or a 1 hour training session, and as soon as we're done, we just pick our stuff up and we go back and we sit at our desk for 8 hours a day. And I always talk about how my members come into my group fitness classes that I coach and they tell me, oh, my back hurts. I'm like, okay, well, do you stretch? And they're usually like, no. And I'm like, do you sit a lot? And they're like, yes. And it's like, okay, our capacity for recovery is much lower with our day-to-day lives and the responsibilities that we have. And we have to be a lot smarter about how hard we're training. And if you're going to increase your training, then you need to increase your recovery. You need to eat more, you need to stretch more, you need to sleep more, you need to do all those things. And if you don't have enough time to commit to the recovery aspect, then you have no business doing more of the fitness aspect.
Yeah, and our bodies shift with that as well. So doing VO2 max testing on people, we can actually see the metabolic changes that happen. And when we focus so much, and again, we'll use that as an example of a interval style exercise. We're going. Yes, there is that gap. Okay, rest, but then you're going right back into it. And so we're pushing towards that high heart rate. And when we only sit in those zones, we're only getting to zone 4, zone 5, and we're never dialing it back, then all our body knows is how to utilize carbohydrates as fuel. So for especially women, I've seen a lot of people come in and say, well, I'm exercising all the time. Why can't I lose weight? All right, well, let's actually take a look and see what's going on. And sure enough, what we can see is even when you're doing low intensity exercise, you've trained your body to just go so high and rev the engine that you can only be utilizing carbohydrates as the main energy source. versus for people who maybe spend a little bit more time in aerobic training, we can actually use that fat as a substrate. And that's a lot more efficient on creating energy in our body. So as we're just existing, after you're done with your interval training, how well then are you utilizing non-carbohydrate sources? So for the people who only do that interval training, they're just creating more dependency on carbohydrates. And then when we also then listen to other influencers saying carbs are evil, then they wonder why they're tired or why they're fatigued at work, they're fatigued at home, because your brain needs glucose. And if your body is overutilizing the rest of that, it can actually create issues neurologically, but then create injuries. So to your point is your body can't physically recover because you don't put it into those zones of being able to be in the aerobic metabolic activity levels. It's a big problem of just understanding why it's important to have balanced exercise. Not everyone needs to run a marathon. Not everyone needs to be long distance runners, but we can't just sit in one of those zones all the time. And so when we go to a group fitness class and I'm always doing interval training, again, what are we doing that's basic? Even just going for a walk, right? If I can get somebody to just commit to give me 30 to 45 minutes twice a week to go on a nice brisk walk, that's going to create recovery. Is then how well do you shuttle lactate out of your system? And so for, again, interval athletes, you need the aerobic capacity to create better recovery, even from a quick perspective, but then that lasting effect afterwards of how well can you change over from overutilizing carbs to, let's go back to fat utilization as our primary substrate.
Right. So let's draw this out a little bit more, because I don't think I've ever talked about the zones and the heart rate zones on my podcast before. So I'd love for you to dive into a little bit more about what the zones are and how can we use them to our benefit to create the metabolic adaptation that you're speaking of, to move away from using only carbs, but also burn a little bit more fat as well, help us achieve our goals while still feeling good and, limiting injury, overtraining, things like that.
Yeah. So a lot of credit has to be given to, I think, people like Peter Attia and Andy Galpin, who are really speaking on a large scale about this stuff. Thankfully, I think we're finally getting to a place where the heart rate zones are a little bit more mainstream. Because for a long time, I don't think anybody was paying attention. I was probably one of those people included. So with heart rate zone training, the idea is, again, getting a little bit of objective data to know where we are when we're training and not just going off vibes.
I love that.
Listen, I like vibes, but at the same time,
friends, we go off vibes.
Yeah. So the idea of heart rate zones is understanding what is your max heart rate. Now, what will happen though is if I buy a smartwatch and I input my data, it's going to give me the 220 minus my age. And that is probably a poor indicator of where people actually are. Now, does everyone need to go get a VO2 max test to know their heart rate zones? Absolutely not. A lot of field tests that you can do. There's a lot of great protocols that you can find online on just how to even get a better estimation of where your heart rate is. Even just go for like a light jog, and then after about 10 minutes, go all out for 3 minutes and then see where your heart rate is, probably getting close to your max heart rate. Once we know where that is, we can divide from 50% to 100%. So if I've got an idea of what my max heart rate is, that's 100%. Then we just go in increments of 10. Depending on who you talk to, they may have nuances on what percentage that actually is. If you just go 10%, good enough. You're probably in that ballpark. So the shift towards this idea of zone 2 training really comes from the aspect of longevity. So when we're discussing things like VO2 max and its relation with longevity, that is a big component of creating better aerobic capacity is in those lower zones. Zone 2 is going to be 60 to 70% of your max heart rate, give or take just a little bit. And you can even go a little bit below. Some people even will include zone 1 into there. So going 50 to 60% of your max heart rate. So sitting somewhere between 50 to 70% is going to be your lower zone training. Then if we go into your 80 to 90%, that's kind of your long interval training. And then your 90 to 100% is getting closer to your max heart rate. So if I'm doing interval training, I probably want to be getting my upper end to that 80 to 90%. Or if it's very short interval training, I want to get it to that 90%. And a lot of the apps and smartwatches will use colors to help you understand all of this. So the 80 to 90% will be orange, and then the max is going to be red versus your zone 1, usually gray, and then zone 2 is going to be your blue. And I like the blue because sky's blue, oxygen, all of that. The idea behind that also should link up to what we're using for energy. So in lower zone training, we are trying to primarily use fat as a fuel substrate. One fat molecule, as it goes through the process of metabolic activity, is going to eventually give us 37 ATPs. And ATP is our basic unit of energy within our body. If we use a carbohydrate source with glucose, that's going to give us 2 ATP. Now, it's much faster for us to change over carbohydrates to ATP than it is for a molecule of fat. But it's a lot more efficient if we're using fat as our fuel source. So that's why it takes longer to do zone 2 training to get that benefit than it does some of those intervals. And what can happen too with interval training is if you're revving your heart rate up into zone 4, zone 5, when you recover, then you're down at zone 2. And you can kind of sit in that zone 2, your heart rate stays slightly elevated post-exercise, where you're still getting some aerobic activity even after interval training. But if you have used your entire glycogen storage and you aren't intaking any more carbohydrates during your workouts, that is going to cause you to fatigue very quickly. And in the running world, we call it bonking, is where you just have no more energy in your body. You feel like you hit a brick wall. So if we're going to be exercising, we want to kind of have a good amount of both. Now, depending on what type of activity you want to be doing, you can spend more time in one versus the other, but making sure we're getting some element of both is always going to be super important to be a well-rounded, healthy person. We'll say athlete, but for the most part, it's just overall being healthy. We don't want to necessarily only always do low-level training, but we also don't want to always be revving up our heart rate to the highest. A lot of people think that's going to make them lose weight, though, is if I train harder, I'm going to lose weight. But if we're never exercising long enough, because it takes roughly 30 to 45 minutes for the enzymes in our body to actually unlock those fat molecules in our system, then that is actually going to kind of prevent us from losing all the weight that we want to. Yes, it's still law of thermodynamics. If we expend more energy than we're intaking, you're going to be in a catabolic phase of losing weight, but we can be smarter about it by actually doing maybe a little bit more zone 2 training to increase the amount that we're unlocking some of those fat molecules within our system. So depending on the goals or the type of activity, knowing what your heart rate is to help dial in that aspect gives you some objective data, because people like myself, I'm a very, very poor subjective rater when it comes to intensity. I can spend time in my zone 4 and think that was easy. And then I wonder why I hit a wall after about 25 minutes, because now I've used all my glycogen and I thought, well, that was easy. And then all of a sudden I have no more energy. So I need that feedback from my watch to tell me where am I on my heart rate zone, so I know not to go too far. And then vice versa. Sometimes people are like, well, I want to just go for a long run, but maybe they are, again, spending way too much time higher up or not ever really getting high enough. Maybe let's push that intensity a little bit more, because if all we do is low, slow cardio activity, then we don't create that true VO2 capacity. So we're never raising that ceiling to actually increase how much oxygen we can actually use for some of that aerobic capacity. So again, both are very good. And if you can create a test that actually helps dial that number in and not just going 220 minus age, that's very helpful for getting closer to what your body is actually going to need in order to be more efficient.
I think that's so helpful, the way that you described it, especially again, because a lot of the messaging right now is so divisive. So you have on one hand, yes, we do want to lift weights. We do want to resistance train. We do want to rest between our sets. But, if you take a traditional bodybuilder, like they're not going to have a ton of aerobic capacity. And then on the flip side, we talk about these more longer style training or hit interval style training, which has its own own benefits, but also own demonization. A lot of people would be like, too much hit is bad for you. It's going to spike your cortisol. It's going to do this and that. And it's really about training intentionally, training in a smart way, and getting a little bit of everything, right? We don't have to just, especially from a health perspective, which is sometimes what I think we lose sight of, because a lot of times we do focus on physique goals or performance goals and whatnot. But at the end of the day, majority of the people, especially the people listening to this podcast, are interested in longevity, really at the backbone of it all. We want to be able to live our lives in a healthy way. We want to live long and abled as much as we can. And our fitness routine right now is what's going to help us do that. And if we create this really nice balanced mix of various different heart rate zones, then we can get that, that health optimization piece while still benefiting from the physique aspect and the performance aspect and things like that.
Yeah, it's about setting the goals, right? If we have a goal, and for some people it is physique, great. But again, how can we set the expectations in a healthy manner to where we're not burning out or creating other health issues? A former intern of mine just competed in a bodybuilding competition, and he documented his entire process of how he got there. And I love that he would brag about actually how many carbs he was eating, not from a restrictive, but he's shown, yeah, I had a cookie. And look at how I still look. It didn't ruin everything that's going on. So it's not all or nothing. And unfortunately, in a lot of fitness spheres, it is, right. You got to be bought into this. You can only do this. Again, nothing is off limits, but it's about making sure that we are, again, setting appropriate expectations and setting a roadmap for what is going to be a healthy way to get there. Because it doesn't do any good to exercise if it's causing more problems than it's helping. This I see with, especially if people are trying to lose weight and then they have joint pain, then a lot of healthcare practitioners say, well, just keep losing weight and you're going to feel better. Well, not if you actually have an injury. So maybe let's address the injury so you can keep exercising. Otherwise, you're going to compensate, which is going to cause more problems. Sometimes pushing through pain is not going to be helpful. And that's even true for just the fatigue element all the time. Push yourself overall, yes. In order for us to adapt, we have to push a little bit. But if every single time we're exercising, you feel like you have to be completely gassed and burnt out, that is not a recipe for longevity. That is going to create a major burnout, maybe physically and mentally. And that is not going to be setting appropriate expectations for staying active and staying healthy for long periods of time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about avoiding that burnout, and we wonder why we're so tired. We wonder why we're feeling like, that burnout feeling of just not wanting to show up, not wanting to do the thing. And it's usually because we spend a period of time pushing really, really hard, like probably too hard, not paying attention to how we can create more variation with our intensity, how to support our body better through the process while achieving our goals and making it more of that longevity piece for sure.
Yeah. And as people are focusing more on this longevity aspect, that the aerobic capacity has a lot of correlation with longevity, right? Is hey, you can actually take things a little bit slower, and that's going to be helpful. Again, it's not about avoiding those other things. Of course, let's be strong. Let's lift some weights. That is going to be fantastic for your joints, fantastic for your muscles, but also like get your heart rate up a little bit, but you don't have to, yeah, you don't have to kill yourself on your runs. And that was probably a big aha moment for myself, even, was understanding that I can run without feeling like I'm going to die. That was probably one of the hardest things for me to learn, was understanding what was going on with my heart rate. And when I did my first triathlon last year, I was like, oh, I can't believe I actually did an endurance thing. I never thought I'd be an endurance athlete, but because I listened to other professionals saying the things I was telling other people, but just not applying it to myself, and then being able to now really demonstrate that to my athletes and my patients on, no, this stuff actually does work. I know it can be counterintuitive because we're getting so many messages on you need to restrict your carbs, you need to do intermittent fasting, and then you also need to do all these intensity exercises. We can be a little bit more simple. And simple has a lot of long-term adherence. That is going to be the best way for us to create not just the longevity for ourselves, but for adherence to this lifestyle. Is just if we keep it simple, that is where we're going to get the biggest buy-in.
I love that because I think we get really excited about the shiny stuff and then we overlook that. I think this was amazing. This is super helpful. Just to wrap it up, I'm really curious. We talked a lot about heart rate measuring. We talked about some of the different wearables that people use. What do you think is the best tool, in your opinion, for if somebody wanted to start measuring their heart rate and, paying more attention to the zones with their training? What do you think is best for that?
Any sort of heart rate monitor is going to be helpful. Ideally, chest monitors are a little bit more accurate than wrist-based monitors. So I try to tell people not to overanalyze if they're only wearing Apple Watch or Garmin, Whoop, all that stuff. While that is helpful from just a monitoring throughout the day, if we're really trying to hone in on the actual heart rate, chest monitors are going to be the best. There are a lot of different variations on the market, but if you want to dial in the heart rates, I would always suggest getting a chest heart rate monitor for that application. And then even just doing a field test of trying to get your heart rate up as high as you can one time to really see what you can hit, and then changing your tech to fit that heart rate zone. Because if you just go by what it comes already built in, it may be slightly off. And I've seen some people where it's off by a significant amount. We're off by 15 to 20 beats per minute. And that's a significant difference in what we're trying to do if that's part of our goals. So some sort of heart rate monitor, chest over wrist, and then just some way for you to be able to monitor. And then teaching people to then feel it when they listen to that. So maybe it's even just watching on your phone for a couple of exercises of, okay, this is what zone 2 feels like versus this is what zone 4 and zone 5 feel like. And if you can marry the objective with the subjective, then that's the best way to create long-term understanding. So that way, even when you don't have the heart rate monitor on or you don't have access to it, you understand what it feels like. So you know how to change in real time based on what your tech was telling you.
Excellent. So helpful. If people want to learn more from you or connect with you, where can they find you?
So they can find me on Instagram at Dr. Blake Graham, and I am in Golden, Colorado at Delta S Performance. So they can also find me at deltasperformance.com. I'm always willing to chat with people and help them find the right fit for what they need and make sure that they are on the right roadmap for hitting their either health or fitness goals.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Anti-Macro Podcast. I hope you found today's insights valuable and actionable for your own wellness journey. Remember, true transformation comes from consistent, intentional steps forward. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to stay updated on all things health and fitness, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a new episode. I release fresh content bi-weekly every Wednesday to keep you inspired and informed. And hey, if you loved what you heard, I'd be thrilled if you could take a moment to share this podcast with a friend or family member who might benefit from it. By sharing it with others, you're helping them on their wellness journey too. Keep striving for progress, not perfection, and I'll catch you next time.